Morty, I fixed your alarm clock. Also, I might have accidentally connected your brain to an interdimensional dream realm. Rick's casual admission sets off one of their most surreal adventures yet, as they find themselves trapped in the Dreaming Citadel, a place where nightmares become reality. As they navigate through landscapes formed from Morty's subconscious fears, Rick realizes his scientific solution has only made things worse. With each step deeper into the Citadel, the walls between Morty's dreams and reality crumble, revealing secrets neither of them are prepared to face. Rick's failed experiment. The whole mess started because Morty couldn't get a decent night's sleep. For the past 3 weeks, he'd been waking up screaming about giant telepathic spiders and being trapped in an endless math exam where Mr. Goldenfold kept morphing into different monsters. Pretty standard nightmare stuff, except Morty's lack of sleep was making him jumpy during adventures, which annoyed Rick to no end. We see this frustration building when Morty accidentally sets off an alien security system because he dozed off while Rick was explaining how to disarm it. Jesus, Morty, you're more useless than usual lately, Rick complained as they narrowly escaped. Your constant screaming at night is keeping the whole house up. I need you functional for our adventures, not hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Morty tried explaining that the nightmares felt different somehow, more real than regular bad dreams, but Rick wasn't really listening. He was already formulating a solution in his workshop, one that applied his particular brand of scientific genius, mixed with complete disregard for safety protocols. Rick worked on his invention for about 3 days straight, maintaining a consistent blood alcohol level the entire time. His garage workbench became covered with strange components, crystalline structures that hummed with energy, tiny metallic devices that occasionally sparked, and what looked suspiciously like parts from the Smith family's toaster. "Grandpa Rick, what are you making?" Summer asked when she wandered in looking for the Wi-Fi password. "Something to shut your brother up at night," Rick answered, not looking up from his work. "Just a simple brainwave modifier that filters out negative neural patterns during REM sleep. Nothing major." But as we've seen countless times with Rick's inventions, nothing major usually means potentially catastrophic. The finished product looked surprisingly mundane, just Morty's alarm clock with some weird attachments and glowing blue crystals where the radio antenna used to be. Rick installed it in Morty's room without much explanation beyond, "This'll fix your nightmare problem, now stop bothering me about it." The first night seemed successful. Morty slept through without screaming once, and the Smith household enjoyed their first peaceful night in weeks. Rick considered the problem solved and went back to his regular schedule of dimension hopping and tinkering with dangerous technology. What he didn't realize was that his drunken modifications had done much more than filter out nightmares. They'd created a bridge between Morty's subconscious mind and somewhere else entirely. On the 7th night, things went very wrong. Rick had fallen asleep at his workbench when a strange, pulsing blue light flooded the house. He woke to find Morty standing in the garage doorway, eyes open but completely blank, sleepwalking, but somehow different from regular sleepwalking. "Morty!" Rick snapped his fingers in front of his grandson's face. "Earth to Morty!" Morty didn't respond verbally, but he raised his hand and pointed toward the wall. The air began to shimmer and distort, folding in on itself in ways that shouldn't be physically possible. Before Rick could grab his portal gun or any other defensive equipment, both he and Morty were pulled through the strange distortion. They landed hard on what felt like solid ground, but didn't look like any ground Rick had ever seen. The surface beneath them kept shifting patterns and textures, sometimes appearing as concrete, sometimes as grass, sometimes as something that resembled television static. "What the hell did you do, Morty?" Rick demanded as he stood up, dusting himself off. Morty finally snapped out of his trance-like state blinking rapidly. Me? I didn't do anything. I was asleep and then suddenly I'm here with you. Rick reached into his lab coat and pulled out his flask, taking a long swig before answering. Well, we're somewhere, and it wasn't my portal gun that brought us here, so it must have something to do with you. As Morty became more aware of his surroundings, panic started setting in. Rick, where are we? What is this place? How do we get home? Rick pulled out his portal gun and fired it at a nearby surface, but instead of creating the familiar green portal, the gun just made a sad wheezing noise and produced a tiny portal that immediately collapsed in on itself. That's not good, Rick muttered, examining the device. Something's interfering with the portal technology. He started pulling out other gadgets from his coat pockets, but each one seemed to be malfunctioning in different ways. Morty's panic was growing. Rick, seriously, what did you do? Rick finally sighed and put his gadgets away. Remember that alarm clock I modified for you? The one that stopped my nightmares? Yeah, what about it? It wasn't supposed to stop your nightmares exactly. It was designed to filter out the negative brain signals during REM sleep that cause nightmares. Simple bioelectrical filtering through a quantum crystal matrix. Morty's eyes narrowed. And I might have been drinking a little when I built it. A little? Okay, a lot. And I might have accidentally tuned the crystal matrix to a very specific interdimensional frequency instead of just filtering your brain waves. Morty threw his hands up in frustration. So what does that mean, Rick? Rick looked around at the shifting environment, his expression growing more serious. It means instead of filtering your nightmares, I accidentally created a bridge between your subconscious mind and a place I've only heard rumors about, a place called the Dreaming Citadel. Morty followed Rick's gaze, noticing for the first time that in the distance, impossible structures were becoming visible. Buildings that defied physics, twisting and turning in ways that hurt to look at directly. Some seemed to be made of solid light, others appeared to be constructed from liquid metal that never dripped or solidified. The Dreaming Citadel is supposed to be a myth, Rick continued, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. A place that exists in the space between consciousness and unconsciousness. No one's supposed to be able to physically go there. Yet here we are, Morty said flatly. Yet here we are, Rick agreed. Your nightmares were probably the first sign. The clock wasn't filtering them. It was connecting you more deeply to this place every night. Morty's anger was building. So you're saying this is your fault? Your drunk science experiment turned my brain into a gateway to some interdimensional dream world. I wouldn't say it's entirely my fault, Rick countered defensively. Your brain was particularly susceptible. Most people's minds would have rejected the connection. Oh, so it's my fault now. I'm just saying there's plenty of blame to go around, Morty. As they argued, neither of them immediately noticed that the world around them was responding to their emotional states. The ground beneath them began to crack and reform. The colors of the sky shifted from a peaceful blue to an angry red, and the distant structures of the Dreaming Citadel grew taller and more menacing. It was only when a jagged crack formed between them, nearly separating Rick and Morty, that they stopped arguing and really looked at their surroundings. The world was literally changing with their emotions, reshaping itself in impossible ways. Rick, Morty said quietly, his anger replaced by fear. Don't panic, Rick said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The Citadel responds to conscious thought. The more emotional we get, the more it changes. So, what do we do? Rick looked down at his malfunctioning portal gun, then up at the impossible cityscape ahead of them. We walk. We find the center of this place and figure out how to get back home. As they took their first steps toward the Dreaming Citadel, the reality around them continued to shift and change, responding to every thought, every fear, and every moment of wonder they experienced. They were in uncharted territory now, even for Rick Sanchez. The Dreaming Citadel revealed. As Rick and Morty approached the strange structures in the distance, the environment around them began to transform completely. The shifting ground beneath their feet solidified into something resembling cobblestone streets, but the stones glowed with faint blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Buildings started rising from nothing, materializing first as transparent outlines before gaining solidity and color. They weren't normal buildings, though. Some twisted like corkscrews into the sky. Others floated completely disconnected from the ground, and a few seemed to be built inside out with their interiors exposed to the elements. "Holy crap, Rick!" Morty exclaimed, spinning around to take in the impossible cityscape forming around them. "What is this place? It looks like something from a fever dream." Rick watched the transformation with an expression that mixed scientific curiosity with genuine concern, a rare combination for him. "This is it, Morty. The Dreaming Citadel. I've heard stories about this place from some really messed up interdimensional travelers, but most of them were so traumatized they couldn't give coherent descriptions. Everyone thought they were just high or crazy. Turns out they were telling the truth." A bridge formed itself out of flowing liquid metal right in front of them, connecting to an enormous structure that resembled a cathedral made of stained glass. Except the glass panels kept changing colors and images, showing scenes that looked strangely familiar to Morty. Moments from his own life, but slightly distorted. "If this place is real, why hasn't anyone properly documented it?" Morty asked, hesitantly stepping onto the bridge, which felt solid despite its liquid appearance. Rick followed, keeping his eyes on the surroundings. "Because no one's supposed to be able to access it while conscious, Morty. This place exists in the space between being awake and being asleep, the liminal zone where dreams form. Conscious beings can't normally enter without specific technology or extremely rare neurological conditions. When I modified your alarm clock, I accidentally created a bridge that shouldn't exist." The implications hit Morty suddenly. "So we're breaking the rules just by being here? Like the fundamental rules of reality?" "Pretty much," Rick confirmed. "We're essentially intruders in a realm that conscious minds aren't meant to perceive directly. It's like breaking into a secure facility, except the facility is an entire dimension of reality that exists solely to process subconscious thought." As they continued walking, Morty noticed the streets kept rearranging themselves. Sometimes, a path they were following would suddenly end at a wall, forcing them to turn around, only to find the way they came had completely changed. Other times, entire buildings would shift positions when they weren't looking directly at them. "The city keeps changing," Morty observed, getting increasingly frustrated. "How are we supposed to navigate this place if nothing stays put?" Rick pointed to a particularly tall spire in the distance that seemed more stable than the other structures. "We need to head towards something fixed. That tower hasn't moved since we got here. But you need to understand something important about this place, Morty. It's responding to your thoughts, especially your subconscious ones. The more you think about getting lost, the more the streets will rearrange to make you lost." Morty tried to focus on the spire, but found his attention wandering to the strange details around them. Shop windows displayed items that morphed from one thing to another. A television might become a fishbowl, then a birdcage, then an old computer. Street signs showed directions to places that couldn't possibly exist, with names like the Forgotten Library and the Ocean Above. "This place doesn't make any sense," Morty complained. "It makes perfect sense, just not logical sense," Rick replied. "It operates on dream logic. The Citadel was rumored among interdimensional travelers for centuries. Most considered it a myth, like Atlantis or a decent Jerry. The few who claimed to have seen it were usually dismissed as delusional. As they walked, Morty began noticing other figures moving through the city. At first glance, they looked like ordinary people going about their business, but on closer inspection, something was off about them. Some were slightly transparent, others moved in strange, jerky motions, and a few seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Are those people?" Morty asked, pointing to a woman who appeared to be shopping at a store that sold nothing but different coloured doors. Rick shook his head. "Not exactly. They're dreamers, Morty. People who are currently asleep in various dimensions and realities. Their subconscious minds are projecting themselves here, creating their own personal dreamscapes. That woman probably thinks she's shopping for new curtains or something normal in her dream. She has no idea she's in a shared space." Morty watched as a businessman in a suit walked confidently through a wall as if it wasn't there. "So they can't see us." "They can, but they'll just incorporate us into their dreams somehow. To that guy, we might appear as co-workers or random people on the street. Everyone perceives the Citadel differently, shaped by their own subconscious fears and desires." This explanation made Morty look more closely at their surroundings. "So, what we're seeing right now is partially shaped by your subconscious, yes," Rick confirmed. "The general architecture of the Citadel exists independently, but the specific details, the colours, the textures, some of the buildings, those are manifestations of what's going on in your head, Morty." They passed what looked like a school building, except the windows showed classrooms full of students with blank faces. Morty shuddered and hurried past it. "That's why no one's ever found this place before," Rick continued, gesturing around them. "The Dreaming Citadel exists in a dimension that sits perpendicular to normal space-time. It can only be accessed through specific brainwave patterns during certain states of consciousness. What my device did was accidentally create the exact frequency needed to bridge your mind directly to this place. And when you sleepwalked into the garage, you pulled me along for the ride." Morty tried to process this information. "So it's like a dream dimension, where everyone's dreams kind of overlap. That's oversimplifying it, but essentially correct," Rick said. "Think of it like a giant server where all dreams are processed and stored. Except it's not digital, it's a dimension of pure consciousness and subconsciousness interacting with each other." They reached a large circular plaza where multiple streets converged. In the center stood a fountain that sprayed water upward, but the water never fell back down. It just disappeared at the peak of its arc. Around the plaza, dreamers wandered in their own realities, some having conversations with people who weren't there, others browsing shops that kept changing their inventory. "It's actually kind of beautiful in a weird way," Morty admitted, watching the impossible fountain. Rick nodded reluctantly. "It's one of the universe's most fascinating phenomena. Under different circumstances, I'd be taking samples and making observations. But right now, we need to focus on getting out before..." He stopped mid-sentence as Morty suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on something across the plaza. Following his grandson's gaze, Rick saw a dark, formless shape emerging from between two buildings. It had no definite outline, more like a shadow that consumed light rather than being cast by it. But there was something undeniably threatening about its movement. "Rick," Morty whispered, his voice tight with fear. "That thing, it's from my nightmares, the ones I've been having for weeks." The shadowy entity seemed to notice their attention. It paused, then began moving directly toward them, growing larger with each passing second. "Well, that's not good," Rick muttered, reaching for his portal gun before remembering it wasn't working. "Remember what I said about this place manifesting your subconscious? Looks like your nightmares just found us." The shadow continued approaching, beginning to take a more defined shape. Something vaguely humanoid, but with too many limbs and a face that seemed to shift between different horrifying expressions. "What do we do?" Morty asked, backing away slowly. Rick grabbed Morty's arm, pulling him toward one of the side streets. "We run, and you try really hard not to think about any other nightmare creatures you've been dreaming about lately." "That's like telling someone not to think about pink elephants," Morty protested as they started running. "Now, I can't think about anything else." Behind them, more shadows began forming at the edges of the plaza, each one representing a different fear from Morty's recent nightmares. Dream logic rules. Rick and Morty raced through the twisting streets of the Dreaming Citadel, trying to put distance between themselves and the shadow creatures from Morty's nightmares. As they ran, Rick kept pulling gadgets from his lab coat, frantically trying anything that might get them out of this situation. His laser gun fired, but the beam curved in impossible spirals before dissipating into butterflies. His dimensional analyzer just displayed a series of random symbols before melting into the shape of a small duck. Even his simple flashlight projected darkness instead of light. "Nothing works right in this place," Rick shouted, frustration evident in his voice as he tossed the useless flashlight aside. "Every piece of technology I have operates based on the laws of physics, and this entire dimension seems to have different rules entirely." They ducked into what appeared to be an alleyway between two buildings that kept shifting their architectural styles every few seconds. One moment they resembled ancient Greek columns. The next, they were futuristic glass and steel structures, then medieval stone towers. The alley provided a temporary reprieve from the pursuing shadows, allowing them to catch their breath. "I don't understand what's happening," Morty panted, leaning against a wall that felt simultaneously warm like flesh and cool like metal. "How do we get out of here if your science doesn't work?" Rick ran his hand through his hair in frustration, a gesture we rarely see from him. "We need to understand the rules of this place first. This dimension operates on dream logic, not scientific principles. Physics, chemistry, even basic cause and effect, they all work differently here." Morty looked around nervously. "What does that even mean? Dream logic?" "It means this place responds to consciousness differently than our dimension," Rick explained, his tone suggesting he was piecing together information as he spoke. "In our world, thoughts stay in your head. Here, they manifest as reality. Emotions shape the physical environment. Time probably flows inconsistently too." As if to demonstrate this point, a clock appeared on the wall next to them. Its hands spun wildly in different directions, sometimes moving clockwise, sometimes counterclockwise, occasionally detaching completely to fly around the clock face like insects. "So, if I think about something, it just happens?" Morty asked skeptically. "Not exactly. It's more complicated than—" Rick started, but Morty interrupted him. "Man, I'm really thirsty after all that running." The words had barely left Morty's mouth when small puddles began forming at their feet. Within seconds, cups of water started materializing on every surface around them. Window ledges, doorsteps, floating in mid-air. They varied in shape and size. Some were ordinary glasses, others were ornate goblets. Some were even sippy cups with cartoon characters on them. As more appeared, water began overflowing, the puddles merging and expanding rapidly. "Morty, what did I just say?" Rick shouted as the water level rose to their ankles. "Your thoughts manifest here. You can't just say whatever pops into your head." The water continued rising, now reaching their knees. Other dreamers, passing by, didn't seem to notice the flood, walking through the water as if it wasn't there, experiencing their own personal dreams. Rick closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and concentrated. Slowly, he raised his hands, and the water began to recede, draining away through cracks that appeared in the ground. "How did you do that?" Morty asked, staring at the now dry alley. "Conscious control," Rick explained, looking slightly drained from the effort. "In the Dreaming Citadel, Strong, focused thoughts can shape reality, but it takes a lot of mental discipline, way more than your teenage brain typically has. They continued walking, keeping to smaller side streets to avoid the nightmare shadows. Rick pointed out patterns in how the Citadel responded to them. "Notice how the buildings get taller when you're anxious," he said, gesturing around them. Morty looked up and realized the structures were indeed growing in height, their windows stretching into long, vertical slits that resembled judging eyes. The sky seemed farther away, and the shadows cast by the buildings grew longer, reaching toward them like grasping hands. "Try to calm down," Rick instructed. "Your emotional state directly affects our environment here. The stronger the emotion, the stronger its effect on reality." Morty took several deep breaths, and the buildings gradually returned to a more normal proportion. The shadows retreated slightly, though they still seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "This is another example of dream logic," Rick continued. "Your emotions shape everything around us. That's why panic is especially dangerous here. It creates a feedback loop. You get scared, the environment becomes scarier, which makes you more afraid, which makes the environment even worse." They came across a small courtyard with a fountain at its center. The water in the fountain flowed upward instead of down, collecting in a floating pool above it. Rick paused, studying the impossible physics of it. "What I don't understand is why my portal gun and other tech doesn't work here," he muttered, more to himself than to Morty. "It's like this place actively resists certain types of interference." "Maybe because they don't belong in dreams," Morty suggested. "I mean, when was the last time you had a dream where your phone worked normally?" Rick looked at Morty with surprise. "That's actually not a terrible observation. Dreams typically distort technology because the sleeping brain struggles to simulate complex systems accurately." He pulled out his portal gun again, examining it. "The Citadel might be imposing its own dream logic on my devices, rendering them useless or transforming them based on dream expectations rather than their actual function." As they discussed this, Morty noticed a group of dreamers nearby having what appeared to be a business meeting at a table that was actually a large tortoise. None of them seemed to find this strange, continuing their meeting as the tortoise slowly moved across the courtyard. "So, what do we do now?" Morty asked. "If your science doesn't work, and this place keeps changing based on my thoughts and feelings, how do we get home?" Rick sighed, a rare admission of uncertainty. "We need to play by the Citadel's rules. If thoughts and emotions shape reality here, then we need to use that to our advantage." To demonstrate, Rick focused intently on a nearby wall. After a moment of concentration, the bricks rearranged themselves to form a small doorway. "See? Conscious control. With enough focus and mental discipline, you can manipulate this environment." Morty tried to imitate Rick, staring at a fallen branch and trying to transform it into something else. The branch quivered slightly, but remained a branch. "It takes practice," Rick said. "And your brain isn't exactly disciplined, Morty. You can barely focus long enough to solve basic algebra problems." "Not helping, Rick. The important thing is to keep your thoughts under control," Rick continued, "especially the negative ones. No fear, no panic, no anger if you can help it. They'll just make our situation worse." Morty nodded, trying to maintain a calm state of mind. "And whatever you do," Rick added, "don't think about intrusive thoughts. You know, those random terrible ideas that pop into your head at the worst possible times. Like imagining pushing someone onto train tracks, or what would happen if you suddenly screamed in a quiet library, or wondering what would happen if giant carnivorous squirrels invaded the Citadel right now." Morty's eyes widened in horror. "Why would you even say that? Now I can't think about anything else." A distant chittering sound reached their ears, and the ground began to vibrate slightly. Around the corner of a building, a massive squirrel's head appeared, its eyes glowing red, its teeth the size of swords. "Oh, great job, Morty!" Rick groaned, grabbing his grandson's arm. "This is exactly why teenagers shouldn't have access to dream dimensions. Your minds are basically chaos engines." They started running again as more giant squirrels appeared, climbing over buildings and dropping from the sky, their movements jerky and unnatural like creatures from a nightmare. "I can't help it," Morty shouted as they ran. "When you tell someone not to think about something, that's all they can think about." "Just try to focus on something safe," Rick yelled back. "Anything boring, math homework, Jerry's stories about his advertising job, anything." But as they fled through the ever-shifting streets of the Dreaming Citadel, Morty found it increasingly difficult to control his thoughts. Each attempt to think of something safe just led his mind to new potential dangers, which promptly manifested around them, turning their escape into a gauntlet of his own mental creation. Rick's tech troubles. After evading the giant squirrels, Rick and Morty found temporary shelter in what appeared to be an abandoned clockmaker's shop. The interior kept shifting between different time periods. Victorian craftsmanship one moment, futuristic holographic displays the next. The only consistent features were hundreds of clocks covering every surface, all showing different times, and some displaying impossible configurations like 13 hours or -minutes. "We need to get out of this nightmare dimension before your brain conjures up something worse than killer squirrels," Rick said, breathing heavily from their escape. He started emptying his pockets, pulling out a seemingly endless array of gadgets and inventions. "I've got to have something in here that can cut through the dream interference." Morty watched as Rick laid out his technological arsenal on a workbench that kept changing from wood to glass to something that looked like solidified smoke. We see Rick's typical confidence when handling his tech, but there's a subtle undercurrent of desperation that's rarely present in his actions. "Okay, let's start with the basics," Rick muttered, picking up his portal gun. "The multiversal constants should theoretically override local dimensional rules." He adjusted some settings, pointed at the wall, and fired. A portal opened, but instead of the familiar green swirl, this one was purple with strange symbols swirling inside. "That doesn't look right," Morty observed. Rick cautiously approached the portal and tossed a small bolt through it. The bolt disappeared into the purple energy, and a second later, it came flying out of the same portal, hitting Rick in the forehead. "Ow! What the hell?" Rick fired the portal gun at different walls, creating multiple portals, but each one simply connected to another portal in the same room. He threw a pen through one portal and watched as it emerged from another, then another, looping through the room in an impossible trajectory before landing back in his hand. "It's creating closed loops," Rick said, staring at the portal gun with growing frustration. "Every portal just leads back here. It's like the dream dimension is folding space around us, preventing any exit points." Rick put the portal gun away and grabbed what looked like a high-tech laser pistol. This quantum destabilizer should disrupt the dimensional barriers. He aimed at the shop's front door and fired. Instead of a destructive energy beam, a stream of bubbles emerged from the barrel, floating harmlessly across the room. Rick stared at the weapon in disbelief, turning it over in his hands. "What just happened?" Morty asked, popping one of the bubbles with his finger. "I have no idea." Rick examined the gun more closely, then watched in shock as it began to transform in his hands. The metal components softened, the advanced technology simplified, until he was holding what looked exactly like a plastic water pistol you'd buy at a dollar store. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Rick groaned, tossing the toy aside. He quickly grabbed another device, a small metallic cube covered in tiny lights and alien symbols. "This is my emergency dimensional anchor. It should stabilize our position in the multiverse long enough to..." The cube began to change before he could finish explaining. The lights dimmed, the alien symbols rearranged into English letters, and within seconds, Rick was holding a magic 8-ball toy. "Ask again later." Rick read the response window in outrage, shaking the former high-tech device. "Are you serious right now?" Morty couldn't help laughing at Rick's predicament. "I think the Citadel has a sense of humor." "This isn't funny, Morty. This dimension is actively sabotaging my technology." Rick reached for a communication device that resembled an advanced smartphone. "Maybe I can contact someone outside the Citadel who can help us." As soon as he touched it, the device began changing, its sleek design becoming blocky and plastic. The screen disappeared, replaced by a circular dial, and within moments, Rick was holding a bright red toy phone with a smiley face on it. "Ring, ring," the toy phone said in a cheerful voice. "Who's calling, please?" Rick threw the phone against the wall in frustration. "This is ridiculous. Every piece of technology I have is being converted into the most useless possible version of itself." "It's like the dream is turning everything into toys," Morty observed, picking up what had once been Rick's laser gun. "Maybe it's because that's how I think of them sometimes. Like, I don't really understand how your stuff works, so my brain just simplifies it." Rick paused, his anger momentarily replaced by scientific curiosity. "That actually makes sense. The Dreaming Citadel is converting my technology based on your subconscious perception of how the devices work." He turned to Morty with an accusatory glare. "You think my quantum destabilizer is just a fancy squirt gun? I mean, it shoots stuff, right? I don't understand all the science behind it." Morty admitted with a shrug. Rick grabbed another device from his pile, a small silver sphere with intricate engravings. "This is a gravity manipulator. It can alter the gravitational constant within a localized field. It's extremely complex technology that took me weeks to perfect." As Rick held it up, the sphere began transforming, the metal becoming rubber, the engravings fading away. Within seconds, he was holding a simple bouncy ball. "A bouncy ball? Really, Morty?" Rick said flatly. "It makes things bounce. Gravity makes things fall." "I guess my brain made the connection," Morty offered weakly. Rick's frustration was reaching a breaking point. We see him try device after device, each one transforming into something childish or simplistic. His laser spectroscope became a kaleidoscope. His matter analyzer turned into a viewmaster with pictures of planets. His defensive force field generator became a bubble wand. "This is your fault, Morty!" Rick shouted, his anger growing with each failed attempt. "Your simplistic teenage brain is ruining sophisticated technology that took me years to develop. If you could just understand basic subatomic principles, maybe we wouldn't be stuck here." As Rick's anger intensified, the clockmaker's shop began to respond to his emotions. The clocks on the walls started ticking louder, their hands spinning faster. The floor beneath them tilted slightly, and the shelves began to shake, dropping more clocks that shattered on impact, but immediately reassembled themselves in increasingly bizarre forms. "Rick, your anger is making things worse," Morty pointed out, grabbing onto a counter to steady himself as the room continued to distort. "The dimension responds to emotions, remember?" "I know that," Rick snapped, which only made the situation deteriorate further. The ceiling began to lower, the walls started closing in, and the clocks were now ticking so loudly it was difficult to hear anything else. "Then stop getting angry," Morty shouted over the noise. "I'm not angry!" Rick yelled, clearly angry. One of the remaining gadgets in his hand, some kind of scanner, transformed into a stress ball with a smiley face on it. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The shop continued to collapse around them, forcing Rick to acknowledge the situation. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. Gradually, his expression shifted from rage to resignation, and the shop slowly stopped its transformation, though it didn't return completely to normal. "You're right. Rick finally admitted, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. My tech isn't going to work here. This dimension doesn't operate on scientific principles. It runs on subconscious rules and emotional responses. So what do we do now? Morty asked. Rick looked around at his collection of transformed gadgets, toys and trinkets where powerful technology had been just minutes before. We have to play by the Citadel's rules if we want to escape. Science can't help us here. He picked up the magic 8-ball and shook it one more time, reading the response with a grimace. Outlook not so good, thanks for that. What does playing by the rules mean exactly? Morty asked. Rick sighed, pocketing the magic 8-ball, the only gadget he kept. It means we need to deal with whatever your subconscious is hiding. The Citadel is connected to your mind specifically. It's your fears and thoughts shaping this place. If we want to get out, we need to find out what your brain is trying to process through all these nightmares. You mean like therapy? Morty asked, sounding horrified. Worse, Rick replied grimly. Dream therapy. With your grandpa. In a dimension that manifests your deepest fears and insecurities as physical threats. He headed toward the door of the shop. This is going to be the most uncomfortable adventure we've ever had. Morty's fears take form. Rick and Morty left the clockmaker's shop and ventured deeper into the Dreaming Citadel, the streets growing narrower and the buildings leaning inward as if watching them. The impossibly tall spires they'd been heading towards seemed closer now, but the path kept twisting and turning in ways that made no logical sense. Sometimes they'd turn a corner and find themselves back on a street they'd already walked down. Other times they'd encounter dead ends that weren't there moments before. The Citadel is definitely responding to something in your subconscious, Rick observed, glancing around nervously. It's like we're walking in circles through your brain. Morty shivered, not from cold, but from a growing sense of unease. Something feels different now, like we're being watched. He wasn't wrong. In the shadows between buildings, dark shapes had begun to form. At first, they were just vague silhouettes, barely distinguishable from the natural shadows cast by the Citadel's impossible architecture. But as Rick and Morty continued walking, these shadows started following them, growing more defined with each passing moment. Rick? Morty pointed behind them. I think we have company. Rick turned to look, his expression hardening as he spotted the shadowy figures trailing them. Don't acknowledge them, Morty. They're manifestations of your subconscious. The more attention you give them, the more power they'll have in this place. But it was already too late. The shadows were taking shape, becoming more solid and recognizable. One shadow stretched and formed into the outline of a teenager wearing a Letterman jacket, Brad, one of the bullies from Morty's school who constantly tormented him. Another shadow morphed into a tentacled alien creature Morty had encountered on a particularly traumatic adventure months ago. More shapes were forming behind those, each one vaguely familiar in disturbing ways. They're people I know, Morty whispered, his pace quickening involuntarily. Not exactly, Rick corrected him. They're how you perceive these people. Your fears and insecurities about them given form by the Dreaming Citadel. The Shadow Brad moved faster than the others, gaining color and definition as it approached. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like stop-motion animation with missing frames. When it spoke, its voice echoed as if coming from the bottom of a well. Look at little Morty Smith, Shadow Brad taunted, his face now fully formed, but with eyes that were completely black. Still thinking he matters. Still thinking anyone would notice if he disappeared. Morty tried to ignore the apparition, but its words hit too close to home. As his anxiety increased, the manifestation became even more solid and detailed. The shadow alien joined in, its features becoming clearer, multiple eyes blinking out of sync, tentacles dragging across the cobblestones with a wet, slithering sound. You remember me? Don't you, Morty? The creature hissed. You left me to die on Gorgon Prime. You could have saved me, but you ran. You always run when things get difficult." "That's not true," Morty protested, forgetting Rick's warning not to engage. "You were trying to eat everyone. I didn't have a choice." Each word Morty spoke seemed to make the manifestations stronger. More shadows were taking form now, creating a growing procession behind them. Rick grabbed Morty's arm, pulling him forward faster. "Don't argue with them," Rick warned. "They're not real. They're parts of your own mind that the Citadel is giving voice to. The more you engage, the more power they have." They turned a corner and nearly collided with a new figure that hadn't been there before. Morty froze as he recognized the distorted form of Jessica. She looked almost like the real Jessica from school, but her proportions were slightly wrong. Too tall, limbs too thin, her smile stretching just a little too wide to be natural. Her eyes glowed faintly with an internal light that the real Jessica certainly didn't possess. "Oh, hey Morty," Dream Jessica said, her voice a cruel parody of the real Jessica's. "Still following me around like a lost puppy? Still thinking you have a chance with me?" She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "It's actually kind of pathetic how much time you waste trying to impress me. Everyone sees it. Everyone laughs about it when you're not around." Morty tried to push past her, but the street had narrowed and Dream Jessica seemed to occupy all available space. "That's not true," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Dream Jessica countered, her smile growing impossibly wider. "You think I don't notice the way you stare? The pathetic little gifts you leave in my locker? The way you rehearse conversations with me that you'll never have the courage to actually start? I notice everything, Morty. And it's embarrassing." Each word hit Morty like a physical blow. He knew this wasn't the real Jessica, but the words seemed to come from somewhere deep inside himself. Fears he'd never spoken aloud, but always carried. As they managed to push past Dream Jessica, the street opened into a small plaza where a massive figure awaited them. Mr. Goldenfold stood at least 12 feet tall, his chalk-covered hands the size of trash can lids, his glasses reflecting light in a way that completely obscured his eyes. "Morty Smith," Dream Goldenfold boomed, his voice echoing throughout the plaza. "The most disappointing student I've ever taught. You have so much potential, yet you waste it. You could actually amount to something if you applied yourself, but you never will. You'll always be exactly what you are now, mediocre, forgettable, average." Morty tried to walk around the giant teacher, but Dream Goldenfold's voice followed him. "Your sister got straight A's in my class. Your father, as pathetic as he is, at least tried. But you're not even interesting enough to be a failure, Morty. You're just nothing." The manifestations were becoming more numerous and more aggressive with each step. Even Summer appeared now, leaning against a lamppost that bent at an impossible angle. Unlike the others, Dream Summer looked almost exactly like the real Summer, which somehow made her presence more disturbing. "God, Morty, do you ever get tired of being such a burden to everyone?" Dream Summer asked, not looking up from her phone. "Mum and Dad are always fighting about you. Rick only takes you on adventures because he has to. I'm the one who has to pick up the slack when you mess up, which is basically always." She finally looked up, her expression a perfect mixture of pity and contempt. "You know what the worst part is? You don't even try to be better. You just accept being the family disappointment." Morty felt himself shrinking with each accusation, physically becoming smaller in the dreamscape as his confidence eroded. Rick noticed and grabbed Morty's shoulders, forcing him to look away from the manifestations. "Listen to me, Morty," Rick said firmly. "These aren't real people. They're manifestations of your own insecurities. The Citadel is pulling your deepest fears out of your subconscious and giving them form. They can only hurt you if you believe what they're saying. But what if they're right? Morty asked, his voice small. They're not right. They're just fears, Rick insisted. Everyone has insecurities, Morty. Everyone has that voice in their head telling them they're not good enough. The difference in the Dreaming Citadel is that those voices get to walk around and talk to you directly. The shadowy manifestations had formed a circle around them now, each one representing someone from Morty's life, each one voicing a specific fear or insecurity that Morty carried. Their voices overlapped, creating a cacophony of criticism and doubt that seemed to physically press in on them. The reason they look like people you know is because that's how the brain processes complex emotions, Rick explained, trying to keep Morty focused on him rather than the encroaching manifestations. Your fear of rejection takes Jessica's form. Your academic anxieties look like Goldenfold. Your family issues appear as Summer, but they're not those people. They're aspects of yourself that you're afraid to confront. As Rick spoke, the manifestations seemed to flicker slightly, as if his explanation was weakening their hold on reality. But they quickly solidified again when Morty looked back at them, their voices growing louder, their accusations more pointed and personal. "We need to keep moving," Rick urged, pulling Morty toward a narrow alleyway that seemed to be the only path not blocked by manifestations. "These things are dangerous not because they can physically hurt us, but because they can trap us here if you start believing what they're saying. The more you accept their reality, the more power they have over you in this place." Uncovering Morty's insecurities. The alleyway Rick and Morty escaped into soon narrowed until it became a dead end, the brick walls stretching upward until they disappeared into darkness. The manifestations of Morty's fears followed them like a parade of personal demons, their voices getting louder as they closed in. Rick frantically searched for another exit, but the dream logic of the Citadel had trapped them in this corner of Morty's subconscious. "There's nowhere to run now," Dream Jessica said, her distorted form blocking one end of the alley. "Just like there's nowhere to hide from the truth about yourself, Morty." The manifestations formed a semicircle around them, each one representing someone from Morty's life, but twisted by his fears into cruel caricatures. Rick positioned himself slightly in front of Morty, though we can see in his expression that he knows physical protection is useless against these psychological threats. "You think you know me," Morty said, his voice shaking but determined. "But you're not real. You're just my insecurities, or whatever." Dream Jessica laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the alley. "We're more real than you want to admit. We know what you really think when you're alone with your thoughts. All the things you're too afraid to say out loud. The things you hide from everyone," Dream Summer added, stepping forward. Her form flickered slightly, becoming more transparent when Morty focused on her, but solidifying again when his resolve wavered. Rick watched uncomfortably as the manifestations began speaking in unison, their voices overlapping in a way that made it impossible to focus on just one. They recited thoughts that Morty had never shared with anyone, private fears and insecurities he'd kept buried deep inside his mind. "You think you're a burden to your family," they chanted. "The least valuable Smith, the one no one would miss if you disappeared tomorrow." Morty flinched, as if physically struck. The buildings around them responded to his emotional state, developing cracks that spread across their facades. Small pieces of debris started falling around them as the Citadel physically manifested the crumbling of Morty's mental defenses. Dream Jessica separated from the group, her movements fluid but wrong, like a puppet with too many joints. "You really believe I could ever love someone like you? You're not special, Morty. You're not even interesting. The only reason anyone pays attention to you is because of what you can do for them. Rick needs you for your brainwaves and as a human shield. Your parents keep you around out of obligation. Even I only talk to you when I need something." "That's not true," Morty protested, but his voice lacked conviction. More cracks appeared in the street beneath them, spreading outward from where he stood. A new figure pushed its way through the crowd of manifestations, Jerry Smith, Morty's father. Unlike the others, Dream Jerry didn't look distorted or monstrous. He looked exactly like the real Jerry, which somehow made his presence more disturbing. "Son," Dream Jerry said, his voice kind but tinged with pity. "You're fighting so hard not to become me. Every decision you make, every risk you take with Rick, it's all to avoid my fate. You see how your mother looks at me, how Rick treats me, how the world walks all over me. That terrifies you more than any alien monster or interdimensional threat." The real Rick glanced at Morty, clearly surprised by this revelation. We see in his expression that this particular fear wasn't one he'd recognized in his grandson before. "You're scared you're already just like me," Dream Jerry continued. "Ineffectual, disrespected, someone whose opinions don't matter, someone who exists to be laughed at, not with." Dream. Jerry's form began to change as he spoke, his features becoming more like Morty's, showing an older version of Morty that looked strikingly like Jerry. The ground shook more violently now, larger chunks of buildings breaking off and crashing around them. The sky above the alley darkened to a deep purple, storm clouds forming and swirling in unnatural patterns. The crowd of manifestations parted to make way for one more figure, a perfect copy of Rick himself. This Dream. Rick sauntered forward, taking a casual swig from his flask exactly as the real Rick would. The real Rick tensed, clearly disturbed by seeing himself replicated by the Citadel. "Let's cut the crap, Morty," Dream Rick said, his voice indistinguishable from the real Rick's. "You know exactly why I keep you around. Your brainwaves create the perfect camouflage for my genius. You're the perfect human shield, disposable, replaceable, and too attached to me to ever walk away no matter how badly I treat you." The real Rick's expression shifted between anger and guilt as his doppelganger spoke. He opened his mouth to object, but no words came out. We see his internal struggle as he can't completely deny the partial truth in these accusations. "You're not special," Dream Rick continued mercilessly. "There are infinite Mortys in infinite realities. I've abandoned dozens of them when they stopped being useful. It's just math, Morty. You're interchangeable parts in the great machine of the multiverse." With each word, the Citadel grew darker and more threatening around them. Buildings began crumbling completely, streets splitting open to reveal endless abysses below. The manifestations grew stronger as Morty's emotional state deteriorated, their forms becoming more solid and detailed while the rest of the Citadel fell apart. Dream Rick leaned in close to Morty, speaking directly into his ear. "Deep down, you know I'm right. You've always known. That's why you follow me on these adventures even when you're terrified, because you think proving your usefulness is the only way anyone will ever keep you around." Morty stood frozen, tears streaming down his face as his deepest fears were voiced aloud. The real Rick finally snapped out of his shock and stepped between Morty and the manifestation. "That's enough," he growled at his doppelganger. "You don't know what you're talking about." Dream Rick laughed. "I'm literally the part of him that believes what you've told him about himself. Every dismissive comment, every time you've called him stupid, every time you've put your needs above his safety. I'm the voice in his head that internalized all of that." The real Rick's face fell as he processed this. He turned to look at Morty, who stood with his head down, unable to meet his grandfather's eyes. The storm above them intensified, lightning striking buildings and causing more destruction throughout the Citadel. "Morty, is this really what you think?" Rick asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "That I only keep you around as a shield and for your brainwaves?" Morty couldn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Rick ran his hand through his hair, visibly uncomfortable with the emotional vulnerability of the moment. "Look, these manifestations they're not entirely wrong," Rick admitted reluctantly, "but they're not entirely right either. Things are more complicated than that." His attempt to dismiss the revelations fell flat, and even Rick seemed to recognize the inadequacy of his response. The dream manifestations had done their damage, exposing Morty's deepest insecurities, his fear of being worthless, his belief that he was unloved except for what he could provide to others, his terror of becoming like his father, and his suspicion that he was nothing but a tool for Rick's adventures. The Citadel continued to deteriorate around them, physical manifestations of Morty's psychological state. Buildings collapsed into dust, streets buckled and cracked, and the sky fractured like broken glass. The real Rick looked around at the destruction, then back at his grandson, finally understanding the depth of damage that had been done to Morty's sense of self-worth, damage that Rick himself had contributed to. "We need to get out of here," Rick said, his voice losing some of its usual confidence. "This whole place is coming apart with your emotions." But the manifestations still blocked their path, growing stronger with each passing moment, as Morty's insecurities took firmer hold. For perhaps the first time in their adventures, Rick seemed genuinely at a loss for what to do next. 8. Rick's scientific limitations. The manifestations surrounding Rick and Morty continued to close in, while the Dreaming Citadel crumbled around them. Rick paced back and forth, muttering scientific formulas and interdimensional coordinates to himself. We see him growing visibly frustrated as each attempted solution dissolved before he could even fully articulate it. He pulled out his transformed portal gun one more time, shaking it violently as if that might restore its functionality, before throwing it against the alley wall where it bounced harmlessly as a rubber toy. "God damn it!" Rick shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the unstable dreamscape. "None of this makes any sense. There has to be a scientific solution." "There's always a scientific solution." Morty watched his grandfather's uncharacteristic display of frustration with growing concern. The manifestations of his fears had backed off slightly, as if they were more interested in watching Rick's breakdown than tormenting Morty further. "Rick, are you okay?" Morty asked, momentarily forgetting his own emotional crisis. Rick stopped pacing and looked at Morty, his expression shifting from anger to something rarer, uncertainty. "No, Morty, I'm not okay. For maybe the third time in my entire scientific career, I'm completely out of my depth here." He gestured at the fractured dreamscape around them. "The Dreaming Citadel doesn't operate on any scientific principles I recognize. It's not responding to logic or reason or any of the universal constants I normally manipulate." "But you're Rick Sanchez," Morty said. "You always find a way out. You always have a solution for everything." Rick took a seat on a chunk of fallen dream architecture, suddenly looking older than usual. "Not this time, Morty. Some problems exist outside the realm of scientific solution." He took a long drink from his flask before continuing. "The Dreaming Citadel operates on emotional and psychological principles that fundamentally contradict my scientific worldview. I can't just throw math and physics at this problem." The admission seemed to physically affect Rick in this reality. His lab coat lost some of its whiteness, his posture slumped, and even his hair seemed less wild and spiky. In a dimension where belief shaped reality, Rick's admission of powerlessness was altering his very appearance. "You're saying science can't help us get out of here?" Morty asked, trying to understand. "I'm saying that consciousness and dreams exist in a realm that even the most advanced civilizations in the multiverse haven't fully understood," Rick explained, staring at his hands as if they had betrayed him. "Every sentient species eventually hits this wall. Sooner or later, they all discover that quantifying consciousness is like trying to measure love with a ruler. The tools of science simply don't apply. Around them, the manifestations of Morty's fears had grown quiet, listening to Rick's explanation as if it somehow validated their existence. The crumbling of the citadel had slowed too, as if the dreamscape itself was interested in what Rick had to say. "I've been here before, you know," Rick continued, his voice quieter now. "Not the Dreaming Citadel specifically, but this problem. I spent 3 years trying to map the dream dimension when I was younger. I built devices to record dreams, to enter them consciously, to manipulate them, all the stuff you'd see in bad sci-fi movies." "What happened?" Morty asked. "I failed," Rick said simply. "I abandoned the project after encountering forces I couldn't quantify. Dreams operate on symbolism, metaphor, and emotional logic rather than cause and effect. I kept trying to apply analytical methodology to something that fundamentally resists analysis." He laughed bitterly. "I don't think I've ever told anyone about that failure before. It's not exactly on brand for the smartest man in the universe." We see in this moment how Rick's scientific limitations are revealed in a way we rarely get to witness. His admission of failure wasn't just about his inability to solve their current predicament, but a deeper acknowledgement of the boundaries of his scientific approach to the universe. There are aspects of existence that transcend scientific explanation, Morty, Rick continued, each word seeming to physically diminish him further in the dream reality. Consciousness is one of them. Dreams are another. The way brains create meaning from chaos. Science can describe the mechanisms, but not the experience itself. Morty looked around at the manifestations of his fears that had tormented them earlier. "So these things, my fears, they're real here because this place works on emotional rules instead of scientific ones." "Exactly," Rick nodded. "In our dimension, your fears are just electrical impulses and chemical reactions in your brain. Here, they're the fundamental building blocks of reality. The dream realm follows rules of metaphor and symbolism rather than physics, which makes my analytical approach completely ineffective." As Rick spoke, the dream versions of Jessica, Summer, Mr. Goldenfold, and even Dream Rick himself seemed to grow slightly more transparent, as if the acknowledgement of their nature was somehow weakening them. "Your nightmares aren't just dreams, Morty. They're your mind trying to process emotional information in the only way it knows how, through symbolic representation. The Dreaming Citadel just makes those symbols tangible." Rick stood up, looking wearily at the manifestations around them. "And my science can't help with that. No amount of gadgets or formulas can solve emotional problems." Morty watched as Rick, the man who always had an answer, who could build a universe in a box or turn planets into dust, admitted that he had reached the limits of his scientific understanding. In this reality, where belief shaped existence, that admission of limitation had actual physical consequences. Rick's lab coat was now a faded grey, his posture stooped, his confidence visibly diminished. "So what do we do?" Morty asked. For a long moment, Rick didn't answer. Then he looked at Morty with an expression that conveyed just how far outside his comfort zone they truly were. "For once, Morty, I think you understand this situation better than I do. This place operates on emotional processing rather than scientific principles. That puts you at an advantage." "Me?" Morty said, surprised by this suggestion. "How am I at an advantage?" "Because unlike me, you haven't spent 70 years suppressing every emotion in favor of cold, analytical reasoning," Rick explained. "You feel things, process things emotionally. In this reality, that's the equivalent of being a super genius." Morty looked at the dream manifestations with new understanding. "So, to get out of here, we don't need science. We need to deal with my emotions directly." Rick nodded reluctantly. The dream dimension operates on principles of consciousness and emotion that transcend scientific understanding. It represents a rare blind spot in my knowledge, but for you, Morty, it might actually be familiar territory. This revelation hit Morty hard. For once in their adventures, Rick's scientific genius wasn't the solution. The problems they faced in the Dreaming Citadel couldn't be solved with a brilliant invention or a complex equation. They required emotional honesty and self-awareness, qualities that Rick typically avoided at all costs. "I never thought I'd say this," Rick said, "but in this specific situation, your emotional processing abilities might be more valuable than my scientific knowledge." Morty stood a little straighter, looking at the manifestations of his fears with new determination. If science couldn't get them out of here, maybe confronting these emotions head-on was their only option. For the first time since they arrived in the Dreaming Citadel, Morty felt like he might actually understand the rules better than Rick did. "Okay," Morty said with growing confidence. "So I need to face these fears directly instead of running from them." Rick nodded, though he looked deeply uncomfortable with this approach. Exactly. In the dream dimension, confronting the symbol might actually resolve the emotional conflict it represents. Morty turned to face the manifestations of his deepest insecurities, drawing strength from the realization that, for once, he might be better equipped to handle this Morty's psychological breakdown. Morty stood facing the manifestations of his fears, trying to summon the courage that Rick suggested he needed, but the weight of all his exposed insecurities proved too overwhelming. We see his confident stance gradually falter as the voices of the dream entities grew louder, their accusations and revelations piling up in his mind like an avalanche. The pressure built rapidly, multiplying with each passing second until something inside Morty simply snapped. I can't handle this," Morty gasped, clutching his head as if physically trying to hold himself together. His eyes darted frantically between the manifestations, unable to focus on any single one. The ground beneath his feet responded immediately, a spiderweb of cracks spreading outward from where he stood. Rick noticed the change instantly. "Morty, you need to calm down. Your mental state is directly affecting the Citadel's stability." But Morty couldn't hear him anymore. The connection between his conscious mind and his surroundings was breaking down, causing the dreamscape to reflect his deteriorating psychological state. The buildings around them began to split down the middle, their structures impossibly remaining upright despite being cleaved in two. The sky above fragmented like broken glass, pieces of blue drifting apart to reveal a swirling void of colors that had no name in any human language. "What's happening to me?" Morty's voice distorted, echoing strangely as if coming from multiple sources simultaneously. When Rick grabbed his shoulder to steady him, he was horrified to see that Morty's appearance was fluctuating rapidly. One moment, Morty appeared as his normal self. The next, he transformed into a more confident version wearing a leather jacket and sporting a cocky smirk. This shifted quickly to a younger Morty, maybe 10 years old, looking confused and frightened. Then came a cold, calculating version with an eye patch that Rick recognized with dread as Evil Morty. These transformations happened in rapid succession, each version flickering into existence for just seconds before being replaced by another. "Your sense of self is fragmenting in the dream environment," Rick explained, trying to keep his voice steady despite his growing concern. "The Citadel is responding to your psychological state, and right now your mind is trying to process too many contradicting self-images at once." The manifestations of Morty's fears had stopped their individual tormenting and now circled him like predators, seemingly fascinated by his breakdown. As Morty continued cycling through different versions of himself, the fear manifestations began to change too. They started losing their individual identities, their forms becoming fluid and merging together at the edges. Dream Jessica's arm melted into Dream Summer's shoulder. Dream Goldenfold's face distorted and flowed into Dream Jerry's chest. The boundaries between these entities dissolved until they were becoming a single, amorphous mass of Morty's combined fears. Rick tried desperately to reach Morty through his breakdown. "Morty, look at me! Focus on my voice!" He grabbed both of Morty's shoulders, trying to physically anchor him to reality, but his hands passed through Morty's form whenever it shifted to a different version. "You're getting lost in your own head, and it's tearing the Citadel apart." The physical world around them continued deteriorating as Morty's breakdown worsened. Streets buckled and folded like paper. Buildings stretched impossibly tall before crumbling into dust. The ground shifted between solid and liquid states, making it nearly impossible for Rick to maintain his footing. Parts of the Citadel began to float upward, defying gravity, while others sank into newly formed abysses. Morty's various personas continued to cycle more rapidly now, barely distinguishable as they flashed in and out of existence. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, his voice a discordant blend of all his different selves, speaking in disturbing unison. "Am I the Morty who's good at adventures? The one who's too afraid to talk to girls? The one who could become evil? The one who'll end up just like Dad? I don't know which one is real." Rick watched helplessly as the combined mass of Morty's fears grew larger, feeding off his identity crisis. It towered over them now, a shifting monstrosity with multiple faces appearing and disappearing across its surface, each one expressing a different version of the same fundamental terrors: worthlessness, abandonment, insignificance. "The real you is all of those things, Morty," Rick shouted over the sound of the collapsing dreamscape. "Everyone contains multitudes, everyone has contradictions in their personality." He dodged a piece of falling architecture, trying to remain close to the rapidly shifting form of his grandson. "You're allowed to be scared and brave, smart and dumb, confident and insecure. That's what makes you a person and not a one-dimensional character." But Morty couldn't process Rick's words. His psychological fracturing had progressed too far, causing his very sense of self to dissolve within the dream environment. The various versions of Morty were now blending together, just as his fears had done, creating a chaotic swirl of identities with no stable center. The manifestation of Morty's combined fears, now a towering abomination, at least 30 feet tall, reached down toward this swirling identity crisis, as if to absorb it completely. If that happened, Rick realized, Morty would be lost entirely within his own fractured psyche. We see the full extent of the Citadel's deterioration now. The entire dreamscape was folding in on itself like a collapsing origami structure. Buildings flattened into 2 dimensions before twisting into impossible shapes. Streets tied themselves into knots. The fragmented sky began falling in jagged pieces that dissolved into mist before hitting the ground. The very fabric of this reality was fraying at the edges, threatening to tear completely. "We're going to be trapped here permanently if this continues," Rick muttered, dodging another falling piece of sky. The pocket dimension of the Dreaming Citadel was collapsing into Morty's fractured mental state, and there would be no escape if the process completed. Rick made one last desperate attempt to reach his grandson. He ran toward the swirling vortex of Morty's fragmenting identities, ignoring the grabbing tendrils of the fear monstrosity. With a running leap, he threw himself directly into the chaotic swirl that had once been Morty Smith. Inside the vortex, Rick found himself floating in a kaleidoscopic maelstrom of memories and identities. Fragments of Morty's life flashed around him. His first day of school, adventures with Rick that went well, adventures that went horribly wrong, quiet moments of self-doubt in his bedroom, rare instances of triumph and confidence. each memory connected to a different version of Morty, and all of them were coming apart at the seams. "Morty!" Rick called into the chaos. "I know you can hear me. All these versions of you exist together. They're all pieces of the same person." He struggled to move through the swirling fragments of Morty's psyche, trying to reach whatever remained of his grandson's core self. "Your fears are lying to you. You don't have to choose just one way to be." For a moment, everything went completely still within the vortex. Then, from somewhere deep within the chaos, Rick heard Morty's voice, his real voice, not the distorted blend of his multiple selves. "Rick, I don't know how to put myself back together." Outside in the collapsing citadel, the towering fear monstrosity loomed over the swirling vortex that contained both Rick and Morty's fractured psyche. With each passing second, the boundaries of the Dreaming Citadel folded further inward, the once vast dreamscape condensing toward this single point of psychological breakdown. If Rick couldn't help Morty reassemble his sense of self, they would both be trapped forever in this collapsed pocket of consciousness, a prison made of Morty's own fragmented mind. Rick's subconscious emerges. As the Dreaming Citadel continued to collapse around Morty's psychological breakdown, something unexpected began to happen. The swirling vortex of Morty's fragmented psyche suddenly took on new colours, blues and greens mingling with the chaotic rainbow of Morty's consciousness. Inside the vortex, Rick noticed it first. These weren't Morty's thoughts and emotions anymore. These were his own. Rick's presence inside Morty's breakdown had created an unexpected bridge between their minds. The Dreaming Citadel, already connected to Morty's subconscious, began accessing Rick's as well. At first, it appeared as small blue flames flickering around the edges of the collapsing dreamscape. These flames quickly grew, taking shapes that Rick immediately recognized with horror, manifestations of his own suppressed thoughts and feelings. "No, no, no, this can't be happening," Rick muttered as he watched his own subconscious materialize in the dream reality. Just as Morty's fears had taken the form of people from his life, Rick's hidden emotions began appearing as physical entities throughout the Citadel. Unlike Morty's manifestations, which were twisted by fear, Rick's appeared more like projections of light, translucent blue figures that seemed more protective than threatening. The first manifestation that fully formed was surprising. A version of Rick himself, but younger, less cynical, his eyes not yet hardened by decades of interdimensional trauma. This younger Rick moved toward the swirling vortex of Morty's fractured psyche and extended his hand, a gentle expression on his face that the current Rick rarely allowed himself to show. "It's okay, Morty," the younger Rick said. "You don't have to face these fears alone." The giant monstrosity composed of Morty's combined fears recoiled from this new manifestation, shrinking slightly as the blue light from Rick's subconscious pushed back the darkness. More manifestations from Rick's mind began appearing throughout the Citadel, not as numerous as Morty's fears, but somehow more substantial, as if Rick's suppressed emotions were particularly powerful due to how rarely they were acknowledged. We see other blue manifestations taking form around them. A blue outline of Morty appeared, surrounded by a protective shield generated by Rick's hidden affection for his grandson. This emotional projection moved directly between the fear monstrosity and the swirling vortex, acting as a barrier against further psychological damage. "What is this?" the real Rick asked, watching his own emotions manifesting around them. I don't feel these things." "Yes, you do," a voice replied. Rick turned to see Beth standing nearby. Not the real Beth, but a manifestation of his daughter composed of the same blue light as his other projections. This dream, Beth looked at Rick with an expression that mixed sadness with understanding. "You left me once," Dream Beth said. "Your greatest fear is that you're doing the same to Morty in a different way. Physically present, but emotionally absent." Rick looked away, unable to face this truth from his own subconscious. "That's not true. I don't get attached. Attachments are just chemical reactions designed to ensure the propagation of the species." Dream Beth smiled sadly. "You can lie to yourself in the waking world, but not here. This place strips away pretenses. Your fear of losing Morty is just as real as his fear of being worthless to you." The Citadel continued to collapse, but the process had slowed significantly. Where Rick's subconscious manifestations touched Morty's fears, a strange stabilizing effect occurred. The opposing emotional energies didn't cancel each other out. Instead, they created a new balance, like emotional counterweights. Rick's scientific genius began manifesting as literal light throughout the Citadel, illuminating the darkness that had been spreading. We see equations and formulae appearing in the air, written in light, creating pathways through the crumbling dreamscape. These scientific concepts weren't actually solving the problem, but they represented Rick's attempt to understand and process his emotions through the lens of his intellect. The most powerful manifestation appeared last, a blue light figure of Rick standing protectively over Morty, one hand extended toward his grandson and the other held up to ward off threats. This figure radiated the most intense light, pushing back the shadows and fear monsters with pure emotional force. "This is embarrassing," the real Rick muttered, watching his emotional depths exposed in this way. Inside the vortex of Morty's fractured psyche, things were changing too. The chaotic swirl of contradicting identities began to slow, influenced by the stabilizing presence of Rick's subconscious. The various versions of Morty, confident Morty, scared Morty, evil Morty, younger Morty, stopped cycling so rapidly, allowing Rick to see each one clearly. "All of these are you, Morty," Rick said, pointing to the different versions. "You don't have to choose just one. You contain all these possibilities, just like I do." As if to demonstrate this point, several versions of Rick began appearing alongside him inside the vortex. Scientist Rick, alcoholic Rick, adventurer Rick, and most surprisingly, family man Rick. Each represented an aspect of his personality that existed simultaneously, contradictions and all. The stabilizing effect spread throughout the Citadel. Buildings stopped collapsing, streets ceased their impossible folding, and the sky fragments paused in mid-fall. The interaction between Rick and Morty's subconsciouses created a new equilibrium in the dream environment, their emotional energies balancing each other in unexpected ways. "Your guilt about Beth balances Morty's fear of being worthless," Dream Beth explained to Rick. "Your hidden affection for Morty counteracts his fear of being unloved. Your scientific light pushes back his darkness. This is why you work together so well in the waking world too, even if neither of you realizes it." Rick watched as his blue light manifestations interacted with Morty's fears, creating a remarkable stability in what had been complete chaos just moments before. His subconscious was literally projecting protection around his grandson, a physical representation of feelings he would never verbally acknowledge. "This is how your subconscious affects the dream reality," Dream Beth continued. "It manifests your hidden affection and guilt, creating a counterbalance to Morty's fears. In this realm of pure consciousness, these emotions have tangible power." Rick was horrified to see his emotional vulnerabilities exposed so completely, but he couldn't deny their effectiveness in stabilizing the dreamscape. The vortex of Morty's fractured identity began to coalesce, the different versions of himself slowly merging back into a single, complex whole. "Rick," Morty's voice came from the center of the now calming vortex. "Is that really how you feel about me?" Rick looked uncomfortable, watching his emotional projections continuing to protect and stabilize his grandson. It's just dream stuff, Morty. Meaningless, subconscious garbage. But in this realm where thoughts directly shaped reality, his denial held no power. The blue manifestations remained solid and undeniable, clear evidence of emotional depths that Rick worked hard to keep hidden in the waking world. As Morty's form gradually stabilized, returning to a single coherent identity, the citadel around them began to repair itself. Buildings straightened, streets reknit, and the sky pieces floated back into place. The balance between Rick's protective emotional energy and Morty's fears created a new stability in the dreamscape, transforming the Dreaming Citadel from a crumbling nightmare into something almost beautiful, a physical representation of their complex relationship. "I didn't know," Morty said quietly, looking at the blue manifestations of Rick's hidden emotions. "Yeah, well," Rick replied gruffly, "neither did I." Confronting the ultimate fear. With the new balance between Rick and Morty's subconsciouses, the Dreaming Citadel stopped collapsing and began to rebuild itself. Streets reconnected, buildings straightened, and the sky pieced back together like a self-healing puzzle. As the environment stabilized, both Rick and Morty noticed something they hadn't seen before. A massive structure rising at the very center of the citadel, towering above all other buildings. Unlike the rest of the city that shifted and changed constantly, this central tower remained fixed, a single point of stability in the ever-changing dreamscape. "What is that?" Morty asked, pointing at the distant structure. It gleamed with an inner light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, drawing their attention inexorably toward it. Rick narrowed his eyes, studying the tower from a distance. "I don't know, but I'd bet whatever's keeping us trapped here is inside that thing. The citadel seems to be organized around it, like a spider web with that tower as the center point." They began walking toward the central tower, the streets of the citadel rearranging themselves to create direct paths rather than the confusing maze they'd navigated before. The manifestations of their subconscious fears and emotions followed at a distance, Morty's nightmares now diminished in size and Rick's blue protective projections hovering nearby. It was as if these aspects of their minds were equally curious about what waited at the center of the Dreaming Citadel. As they approached the central tower, they could see it wasn't a fixed structure at all. It constantly transformed, shifting between different architectural styles and forms. One moment it appeared as a massive crystal spire, reaching impossibly high. The next it became a dark fortress with walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Then it morphed into something resembling a giant tree with branches that moved like tentacles. "It's responding to us," Rick observed, changing based on our proximity and thoughts. The tower continued morphing as they got closer, each transformation seeming to represent different fears. When it briefly took the form of a prison, Rick visibly flinched. When it became a school building, Morty stepped back. The tower was cycling through representations of their deepest anxieties: confinement, judgment, exposure, insignificance. "I think this is it, Morty," Rick said quietly. "The core of this place, whatever's keeping us trapped, has to be inside." As they reached the base of the tower, it suddenly stopped its rapid transformations. The shifting structure settled into a form that surprised both of them, a perfectly ordinary suburban house. Not just any house, but an exact replica of the Smith family home. Every detail was perfect, from the slightly chipped paint on the garage door to the flower beds Beth had planted last spring. "Our house? That's the big scary center of the dream dimension?" Morty asked, confused. Rick approached the front door cautiously. "Don't let the familiar appearance fool you. This is the manifestation of something important, something keeping us trapped here." They entered the dream house, finding the interior just as perfect a replica as the exterior. Family photos lined the walls. The familiar furniture was arranged exactly as it should be. Even the smell of Beth's cooking wafted from the kitchen. But something felt deeply wrong about the place. Rick and Morty made their way to the living room, where they found Beth, Jerry, and Summer sitting on the couch watching TV. They were laughing and talking, appearing completely at ease and happy. But when Rick tried to get their attention, they didn't respond at all. "Hey, hello? Earth to Jerry, you idiot." Rick waved his hands in front of his son-in-law's face, but Jerry continued his conversation with Beth as if Rick wasn't there. "They can't see us," Morty realized, trying unsuccessfully to touch Summer's shoulder, his hand passing right through her like smoke. "It's like we're ghosts or something." Rick stepped back, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. "This isn't just a replica of our house, Morty. This is a version of your home where we don't exist, or more accurately, where we're not needed or missed." Morty watched as Dream Beth laughed at something Dream Jerry said, a genuine happiness in her expression that Morty rarely saw in reality. Dream Summer wasn't on her phone ignoring everyone. Instead, she was engaged in the family conversation. They looked like a perfectly normal, functional family. "Look how happy they are without us," Morty said quietly. "Mum's not stressed about your dangerous inventions. Dad's not insecure about his place in the family. Summer's actually present instead of trying to escape through her phone." Rick watched the scene with an uncharacteristically vulnerable expression. "This is it, Morty. This is the core fear that's been keeping us trapped. Not monsters or manifestations of individual insecurities. This is the big one we both share." "What do you mean?" Morty asked, though his expression suggested he already understood. "The fear that we don't matter," Rick said bluntly. "That all our adventures, all the crazy things we do, all the risks we take, none of it actually makes any difference. That the family might be better off without us. That the universe wouldn't notice if we disappeared." The Dream family continued their perfect domestic scene, completely oblivious to Rick and Morty's presence. They passed through the room, walking directly through Rick and Morty, as if they were completely incorporeal, reinforcing their apparent insignificance. "This is what's been keeping us trapped in the Dreaming Citadel," Rick continued. "Not your personal fears or my emotional baggage, but this shared core anxiety. The ultimate existential dread that underlies everything else. What if none of it matters? What if we don't matter?" Morty watched his dream family, a mixture of emotions playing across his face. "But how do we get out? How do we fight something like this?" "We acknowledge it," Rick said simply. "That's how you defeat any fear. You look it dead in the eyes and recognize it for what it is." He turned to Morty. "This fear of meaninglessness? It's valid. It's actually the most rational fear in the multiverse. In an infinite cosmos with infinite realities, nothing truly matters on a universal scale." "That's not helping, Rick." "I'm not finished," Rick continued. "Nothing matters on a universal scale, but things can matter on a personal scale. The family probably would be happier in some ways without us around, but they'd also lose something important. The connections we make, the people we choose to care about. That's the only meaning that exists, and it's enough." As Rick spoke these words, the dream house began to waver slightly, its perfect details becoming less distinct. The dream family flickered like a television with poor reception. "The fear loses power when you confront it directly," Rick explained. "When you stop running from it and just accept it as part of existence." Morty considered this, then nodded slowly. "I guess I am afraid that nothing I do matters, that I'm just a sidekick in your adventures, or that the family would be fine without me. And I'm afraid that my presence in their lives causes more harm than good," Rick admitted. "That Beth would have been better off if I'd never come back into her life. that I'm just continuing a cycle of dysfunction. With each admission, the dream house became more transparent, the dream family fading like morning mist. The walls of the house began to dissolve, revealing the swirling energy of the Dreaming Citadel behind them. "The fear doesn't go away," Rick said. "It's always there, but acknowledging it takes away its control over you." The dream house had almost completely disappeared now, leaving only the faintest outline. In its place, a swirling portal began to form, glowing with the familiar green energy of Rick's portal gun. "Is that—" Morty started. "Our way home," Rick finished. "The Citadel is releasing us now that we've confronted the core fear." They stepped toward the portal together, leaving behind the fading dream house and the manifestations of their subconscious that had tormented and protected them throughout their journey in the Dreaming Citadel. The portal glowed brighter as they approached, beckoning them back to their reality. Conclusion. The green portal deposits Rick and Morty back in the garage, the entire adventure having taken just minutes in real time. Rick immediately gets to work on the alarm clock without saying a word about what happened. We see him adding different components this time, small crystal filters, and a miniature protective field generator that blocks interdimensional frequencies while still allowing the nightmare filtering function to work. Morty watches Rick work, neither of them directly acknowledging what they learned about each other in the Dreaming Citadel. There's no heartfelt conversation or emotional unpacking, just silent understanding as they work together on the modified device. That night, Morty sleeps peacefully for the first time in weeks. Rick sits in the hallway outside Morty's room, pretending to work on a small invention, but actually keeping watch, a silent guardian against the dreams.